Hi, I'm Stefan of stefangourmet.com. My passion is food and cooking. I like to discover new recipes and new techniques and share them with the world on my blog. I started blogging 11 years ago, around the same time when I discovered sous vide. This is why a large part of stefangourmet.com is dedicated to sous vide, with hundreds of articles on sous vide, including recipes, comparisons between various time and temperature combinations for a myriad of ingredients, and technical background articles. When you Google the time and temperature to cook an ingredient sous vide, you will get huge variations in what people describe as the best temperature and time. How is this possible? There is no such thing as a best time and temperature. It is not a matter of right or wrong. There are actually three valid reasons for these differences. First, a difference in the desired outcome. Would you like your meat medium rare or well done? Would you like your meat firm but tender and juicy, like a steak, or braised and flaky? Second, a difference in size. For example, there can't be a standard time to use for any chicken breast fillet out there, because a large one will require more time than a small one. And a chicken breast roulade will take even more time. Third, a difference in meat quality. In this case, with meat quality, I mean tenderness. For instance, grass-fed beef is often less tender than grain-fed beef, and could therefore require more time in the sous vide to become tender. There are, however, other factors than tenderness, such as sustainability or health, for which grass-fed beef may actually be considered to be of a higher quality than grain-fed. Apart from these three good reasons why variations in time and temperature for a particular type of meat can vary considerably, there is some ignorance out there as well, especially regarding food safety. For example, many chefs have been taught in the past that poultry or pork needs to be heated to a certain core temperature without taking into consideration the time that the core will be held at that temperature. Such antiquated notions will lead to temperatures that are too high without a valid reason. Having said all this, in this video I will teach you 4 easy steps to choose the time and temperature to cook meat sous vide that will always give you the result that you want. Step 1. How done do you want it? Step 2. How much time is needed to heat it through, based on the thickness and shape, and whether it is just chilled or frozen. Step 3. Is it a tender or a tough cut of meat? And how tender do you want it? Step 4. Does it need to be pasteurized? Let's look at each of these steps. Step 1. How done do you want it? The temperature determines how done the meat will be. The photo shows a piece of steak cooked at various temperatures. 50 Celsius or 122 Fahrenheit is rare. 55 Celsius or 131 Fahrenheit, medium rare. 60 Celsius or 140 Fahrenheit is medium, and 70 Celsius or 158 Fahrenheit is well done. With conventional cooking, tough meat like beef short ribs can only be tenderized by braising, so it will become well done and flaky. You can also do this with sous vide, but with sous vide you also have the option to serve beef short ribs medium rare and as tender and juicy as a ribeye steak. By cooking for a long time at low temperature, such as 48 hours at 57 Celsius or 135 Fahrenheit. After deciding the temperature in step 1, the remaining 3 steps are used to determine the time. For this, it is important to understand that sous vide cooking has 2 stages. The first stage is to heat through the meat, so that it will have the same temperature from the outside all the way to the center in the thickest part. The second stage is to then hold the meat at that temperature to tenderize or pasteurize it, or both. Stage 1 is always required, and the time needed to heat the meat all the way through depends on the thickness and shape. This time is determined in step 2. the time for tenderizing is determined in step 3, and the time for pasteurizing in step 4. It is important to remember that the time for stage 2 does not depend on the size of the meat. Once all of the meat has reached the desired temperature, the tenderizing or pasteurization process happens everywhere in the meat at the same speed. So, the time to heat through does depend on the size, but the time to tenderize or pasteurize does not. Let me illustrate this with an example. If you have to transport apples from the orchard to the warehouse, the time needed to load the apples into your truck will depend on the amount of apples. But once the apples are in the truck, the time needed to drive the truck from the orchard to the warehouse will be the same, regardless of whether you just have one apple in there or if it is full of apples. In step 2, we determine the time needed to heat the meat through. This depends on the thickness and the shape. It does not depend directly on the weight. Let's compare a steak of 25 by 16 centimeters and 2.5 centimeters thick, and a sausage with a length of 25 centimeters and a diameter of 7 centimeters, and finally a meatball with a diameter of 12.5 centimeters. All of these have a weight of about 1 kilo, but the heating time is very different. It is 35 minutes for a steak of 1 kilo, almost 3 hours for a sausage of 1 kilo, and even 5 hours for a meatball of 1 kilo. The table shows the heating time by thickness and shape. Slab refers to a steak or another piece of meat that is relatively thin in one dimension compared to the other two dimensions. Cylinder refers to a sausage or roulade, and sphere refers to a ball. These times are for refrigerated meat. A rule of thumb is to add 50% of the time if you cook directly from frozen to allow for the additional time needed to defrost. This is, by the way, much faster than defrosting the meat first, and is certainly safe if the cooking time is less than 4 hours. The thermal diffusion mathematics to calculate how much time it will take for the core of the food to get close to the water temperature are quite complicated. So, it is best to use a table for this purpose, such as the one shown right now. Some people use rules like so many minutes per inch of thickness, but such rules are wrong. The heating time is a quadratic function of the thickness. That means if the meat is twice as thick, it will take 4 times as long to heat it through. For instance, a steak of 2.5 centimeters thick, or 1 inch, will take 35 minutes to heat through. But a steak of double that thickness, 5 centimeters or 2 inches, will take 4 times as long, 2 hours and 20 minutes. I've constructed this table by simplifying and rounding the tables published by Modernist Cuisine. If you use the times in this table, the center of the meat will be heated to 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit less than the temperature of the sous vide. This is close enough for all practical purposes, and it will take a lot longer to get the core temperature of the meat closer to the sous vide temperature than that. I know many people use tables published by Douglas Baldwin, and his heating times are a lot longer than this, because he has calculated them to heat within half of a degree Celsius or 1 degree Fahrenheit. The reason why the final bit of heating happens so slowly is that the speed of heat transfer from the water to the core of the meat is determined by the temperature difference between the water and the core of the meat. Initially, the meat is at refrigerator temperature, about 5 Celsius or 40 Fahrenheit. So the difference with the water temperature is large, and the transfer of heat progresses quickly. But once the core of the meat has almost reached the temperature of the water, the core temperature of the meat will rise very slowly. This is why it takes a very long time to heat from 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit below the sous vide temperature to half of a degree Celsius or 1 degree Fahrenheit below the sous vide temperature. So now that we've decided on the heating time in step 2, the next step is to determine whether we are dealing with a tender cut of meat or a tough cut of meat. Some cuts are always tender, such as filet mignon, chicken breast, ribeye, rack of lamb, or venison backstrap. Tenderness of some cuts depends on the quality of the meat, like flank steak, skirt steak, flat iron steak, blade steak, and hanger steak. Sometimes these cuts can be prepared in the same way as a tender steak like ribeye, especially if they are sliced thinly against the grain. But sometimes they can be quite tough. This can depend on a lot of factors, such as the age of the animal, whether it is grass-fed or corn-fed, the breed, the slaughtering practices, for how long the meat has been aged, and whether any mechanical tenderization has taken place. Some cuts are always tough, such as oxtail and shank, which is also known as shin, ossobuco, or hammock in case of pork. Tender meat only needs to be heated to the desired core temperature. Then it will be cooked and ready to eat, unless you want to pasteurize. I will talk about pasteurization in step 4. Tough meat will need more time after heating it to the desired core temperature to become tender. Toughness is caused by connective tissue, which breaks down slowly at 55 Celsius or 131 Fahrenheit and more quickly at higher temperatures. The rate of tenderization is higher if the temperature is higher. However, if you heat meat to a high core temperature, initially the meat will actually become tougher through contraction at the high temperature. So, meat may be tougher after half an hour at 74 Celsius or 165 Fahrenheit than after half an hour at 55 Celsius or 131 Fahrenheit. To make meat more tender, add more time. This will work at any temperature at 55 Celsius, 131 Fahrenheit or higher, but it may take a very long time indeed at such a low temperature. For instance, oxtail will take 6 days at 57 Celsius or 135 Fahrenheit to become tender. If you tenderize the meat too much, it may become mushy. I've only provided a rough guideline for the time needed to tenderize tough meat at different temperatures because it depends on the initial toughness of the meat, as well as your personal preference. If you cook meat sous vide at very high temperatures, above 80 Celsius or 175 Fahrenheit, then the result will be quite similar to a traditional braise on a stovetop or in the oven. But with sous vide for 48 hours at 68 Celsius or 155 Fahrenheit, or 24 hours at 74 Celsius or 165 Fahrenheit, you may obtain a braised result that is more tender and juicy than with a traditional braise. As mentioned in step 1, you can even turn a cut that is traditionally used for braising, like short ribs, into something that is as tender and juicy as a steak. In the final step, which is step 4, we determine whether the meat needs to be pasteurized. By pasteurization, we mean killing 99.99997% of any pathogens that may be present in the meat. It does not kill the spores, so the pathogens may grow back after pasteurization, and it does not eliminate toxins, so you can't fix meat that has gone bad by pasteurizing it. However, it does make meat that has a higher risk of contamination a lot safer to eat if you pasteurize it. It is therefore recommended to pasteurize poultry, ground or perforated meat like mechanically tenderized meat, and wild game. You can simply add the time for pasteurization from the table to the heating time. Use the time for a temperature that is 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit less than the sous vide temperature, because the heating times are calculated for 1 or 2 degrees less. Pasteurization is achieved more quickly at a higher temperature. It can take over 5 hours at a low temperature or just a few seconds at a high temperature. When pasteurizing at a low temperature, you have to make sure the temperature of your sous vide is accurate. If the actual water temperature is just a few degrees lower, the pasteurization may not be finished by the time you think it is. Tenderizing and pasteurization happen at the same time, so you don't need to add up the time for steps 3 and 4. If the time needed for tenderizing is longer than the time needed for pasteurization, then the meat will also be pasteurized if you tenderize it. Now that I've explained all 4 steps, let's look at some examples. The first example is a ribeye steak. In step 1, I decide I like it on the rare side of medium rare, so I choose 52 degrees Celsius. In step 2, I measure the thickness of the steak. As it is a slab of 2.5 centimeters thick, the heating time is 35 minutes. It is a tender cut and it does not require pasteurization as it is beef, so no additional time is needed for steps 3 and 4. The second example is a burger. I like my burger medium rare, so I pick 55 degrees Celsius in step 1. The burger is 4 centimeters thick, so in step 2 the heating time is 1 hour and 30 minutes. As the diameter of the burger is rather small in relation to the thickness, the time that is needed may actually be a bit less, but that is nothing to worry about. As the burger is ground, it is already tender, and so no time for tenderizing is added in step 3. Because the burger is ground meat, any contamination that was on the outside of the meat may have ended up inside. Therefore, it is safer to pasteurize it. Since I'm cooking the burger at 55 degrees Celsius, the pasteurization time for 54 degrees Celsius is needed. This is 2 hours and 17 minutes. Adding up the time from steps 2 and steps 4, the total cooking time is 3 hours and 47 minutes. I round this to 4 hours. The final example is a tough flank steak. I know that tender flank steak exists that can be treated like ribeye. But this flank steak from grass-fed European beef was too tough when I tried that. Although I prefer my steak on the rare side of medium rare, at 52 degrees Celsius the tenderization will be very slow or does not occur at all. So, instead of 52, I decided in step 1 to pick 55 degrees Celsius to get a medium rare flank steak. The heating time in step 2 is 35 minutes, but that is negligible compared to the 24 to 72 hours that will be needed to tenderize the meat. And that is the result of step 3. Although in step 4 the meat does not need to be pasteurized, it will definitely be pasteurized after 24 to 72 hours at 55 degrees Celsius. In summary, there are 4 easy steps to determine the time and temperature to cook meat sous vide. In step 1, you determine the temperature based on how done you want your meat. In step 2, you look up the time needed to heat the meat all the way through in the table, based on the thickness and shape. If the meat is tough, you add more time in step 3 to tenderize it. If the meat is tender, but you need to pasteurize it, you add the time from the pasteurization table in step 4. I hope this video was helpful. You can find a more detailed description of the 4-step method to determine the time and temperature in an article on my blog, stevongourmet.com. Thank you for watching, and if you do visit my blog, please leave a comment and feel free to ask any questions.